Respecting everyone's time, which is precious, we will start. John, you're going to let people in, right?
Yes, I am.
And welcome. You'll have to unmute yourself. My name is Norbert de Costa. I'm the current president of the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement, Canada, or the Toronto region branch of the World Federalist Movement, Canada. I welcome you all to today's event. The Toronto region branch is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The dish represents the land, and the spoon represents the peoples of the treaty. The treaty is to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures humans share with it. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that the peoples of the treaty must keep the peace. World Federalists, like the participants in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, view the world as one society, embracing all of humanity in all its diversity. We call for urgent progress in developing democratic world institutions, which are essential to assure a peaceful, just, and ecologically sustainable world community. Today's event consists of two parts. Between now and approximately 3 p.m., we will have a presentation on economic freedom for all through progressive capitalism and a world federation. This presentation will be followed by the 2025 annual members meeting of the Toronto Region branch of the World Federalist Movement Canada between approximately 3 and 4 p.m. Non-members are welcome to join us as non-voting observers, learn about our branch and contribute ideas. Whether you are a member or non-member, I welcome all to contribute to the discussions or ask questions freely, but try to keep them concise to maximize the number of questions and answers that can be undertaken. I will now pass the virtual floor to John Cohen, our Secretary and Treasurer of the branch, to introduce our featured speaker. John, over to you.
Thank you, Norbert. I'm highlighting Peter Benton, who will be speaking in a minute. Will be our speaker. And first of all, some background on Peter. He has a BA and an MA in economics from Western and Queen's universities. He was a senior economist in the Ontario government's Ministry of Finance for 24 years. Since retiring, he's published articles on political economy, including quote, towards world federalism for international peace and a sustainable environment, amongst other articles of his. He's active in the Canadian Pugwash Group and a prolific director in the Toronto Region branch. He's made presentations to our branch in the past, and we appreciate him doing so again now. So, Peter, over to you. I'll turn on your slides right now. Let me just share the screen and start the presentation for you. Okay.
Well, thank
John,
you very
I'm
much.
going to leave and come back in.
Okay.
Carry on.
So, thank you very much for the introduction, John, and for helping me with this this presentation. On the first slide, I thought I would provide a little historical perspective by introducing the book by Friedrich Hayek, 1944 book called The Road to Serfdom, which is quite different, of course, than The Road to Freedom that Joseph Stiglitz is a book about. Coming out of the Great Depression, Friedrich Hayek in 1944 proposed a smaller role for government and less collective action in order to avoid what he called the road to serfdom. Hayek and his later disciple, Milton Friedman, worried that regulations and other government interventions, whatever their intent, would would impair the freedoms of individuals. They agreed that only capitalism delivered more freedom than any other system, but that freedom than any other system, but the freedom could only be could only be just aimed at a more purified version of capitalism, which is now neoliberal capitalism, about which I'll speak later. Stiglitz's book, of course, takes the opposite view. He promotes a role for government, a much larger role for government, and much more regulation to expand freedoms for all. And he also, in some detail, explains why neoliberal capitalism has failed, which I will deal with later. So, John, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so this, The Road to Freedom, Economics, and Good Society, is Stiglitz's book, published in 2024 by W.W. Norton in New York. Stiglitz's objective for the book is to describe an economic and political system in the U.S. That is efficient and equitable, but also based on moral values. Freedom is the most important value, but freedom, he says, is freedom with ties to notions of equity, justice, and well-being. So, John, next slide. So the meaning of freedom takes from a quote from Oxford philosopher Isaiah Berlin. So freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. So freedom, what this boils down to is that freedom to act by one may cause harms to others. And these harms are also called unfreedoms or externalities. The freedom can be therefore increased through regulation and prevention of the harms. However, the need for regulations, which could be large, can be reduced if goods are provided, public goods are provided and are financed by taxation rather than by capitalist firms in the market. Next slide, John. So the failure of neoliberalism has a number of points. First of all, neoliberal capitalism was declared broken at a landmark Monk debate in Toronto in 2019, some 50 years after neoliberal capitalism started. Its failure is basically due to three things. It failed to limit greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. It produced a huge financial crisis in the United States and the world, 2008. And it prompted the 2011 Occupy movement on the huge inequality of wealth and income. Now, the maldistribution of income and wealth is a central theme of Stiglitz's book. This results from the historical distribution of the political power of the rich in the U.S. society. The freedom of the minority of rich has been advanced at the expense of the unfreedom of the majority who are not rich. So what we have in the United States over the last 50 years is essentially a de facto system of oligarchy, which is the opposite from democracy. In oligarchy, the minority of the rich rule over the majority of the Democrats. And in democracy, the majority of the non-rich govern over all the citizens. So if you could go to the next slide, John. So Stiglitz presents an alternative to neoliberal capitalism described as progressive capitalism or a rejuvenated social democracy in the U.S. Democracy puts the well-being of all citizens at its center objective and takes human flourishing as the objective of the U.S. economic and social system. The good health and education and a certain level of material well-being are necessary conditions for this, but not sufficient, as I'll discuss later on. So the next slides outlines Stiglitz's framework for achieving the system of progressive capitalism. John, if you can go to the next slide. So number one, part of the framework is creating what he calls a learning society, which involves learning from the discoveries of new technologies through advances in science, learning how the U.S. political, economic, social system actually works, learning how to redesign institutional arrangements to better achieve the objectives for which they were created, and more adept at coordinating with other institutions, and learning about ecology and ecological integrity and how to live within planetary boundaries. One of Stiglitz's primary objectives is to retain the environmental system by limiting greenhouse gas. That's front and center, as he puts it, of his system. The Learning Society will facilitate the evolution of the economy to create what he calls a good society. And most importantly, learning through formal education extends not only to the young, but should be a practice for most of us in all our lives. This is a huge change in the culture of the United States and many so-called democratic states in the world. So John, would you try the next slide? So another attack is a decentralized economy with what he calls a rich ecology of institutions. These involve a mix not only of public and private profit organizations, but also cooperatives and not-for-profit organizations, and a lot of civil society organizations in the country. Governmental institutions have to operate at all levels, at local, state, provincial, or national, and global levels, such as the United Nations and its many agencies. A large part of the economy is not driven by profits. And finally, reconstructing the economic and legal system, rule by rule, regulation by regulation, and institution by institution, which is serious because there are many institutions in the legal system that have failed to preserve the so-called guardrails of U.S. Society against the growing autocracy that has occurred over the last 50 years. So John, the next slide. Very important to Stiglitz is rebalancing power relationships for progressive capitalism. So first of all, restraining corporate power by encouraging the entry of new firms to reduce monopoly power. This has been a prominent deficiency in the U.S. For over 50 years. There's essentially been no attempts to reduce monopoly power of large multinational corporations. Secondly, strengthen workers' rights through labor unions. And thirdly, sort of more generally, there needs to be a rebalance of power relations not only in the household, the firm, the economy, and politics, but all of these are for shared prosperity and creating what he calls a good, decent, democratic society. Sharing power relations in the firm sometimes involves uh, uh, coordination between the capitalists and labor on how to organize the work process and other activities like that, which show some promise. Finally, we have to reconstruct the economic and legal system, rule by rule, regulation by regulation, and institution by institution. So there's a wholesale set of reforms envisaged by Stiglitz. So could we go to the next one then, John? Organizing society for social justice is sort of a new addition to the previous reforms. Full employment, decent incomes for all, and rights to a healthy environment and equal opportunity are considered basic rights. Secondly, the reduction of large inequalities in income and wealth. Corporations will be achieved through increased tax rates on capital gains from investment in capital markets. That's a primary initiative for reducing inequalities, because the level of private wealth on top of the GDP of the United States is just absolutely enormous compared to what it was 50 years ago. Thirdly, and this is probably the most complicated one, the socially just and fair economic, political, and social system would be chosen behind what is described as a veil of ignorance. That's veiled in a genuine democracy, as described by John Rawls' 1970 book, The Theory of Justice. Rawls reasoned that people behind their veil of ignorance about how they will fare in the future, in a future of uncertainty, would choose two principles. The first principle of equal rights requires equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties. The second principle, which was that social and economic inequalities of wealth and authority are just only if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular for the least advantaged members of society. This second principle is the so-called difference principle of Rawls, and it is associated with the term justice as fairness. And several references are used in Stiglitz's book to analyze how alternatives would fit within this theory of social justice. So John, can we go to number? Finally, improving democracy. Government failure is evident when government policies are driven more by short-term political gains or special interest groups that profit from those policies than they are by the long-term interests of society as a whole. Secondly, government fails when money dominates policies. That inevitably leads to corruption, and there's a lot of discussion in various parts of how the corporations are the ones that are dominated by money are driving policy of the federal government, and in addition, probably most important is what is required to improve democracy is an active civil society with citizen participation, plus an active, diverse, and diversified press, plus adaptive learning institutions and checks and balances, which contribute to more democracy that will lead to economic success. This is probably the most problematical, I believe, is that the U.S. society is characterized by a massive disinterest in politics, in political participation. So there will be major changes in, shall we say, the culture that are required to get us to a more fair democratic democracy in the U.S. It's the next slide, John. Among the last is an independent media, and I hope that Rose is included in this. This will be very great interest to her. I've just chosen three specific quotations from Stiglitz's book on this issue, which is of great importance. So the first is: the greatest danger of the social media platforms is their power to create meta-narratives. That is, the understandings that shape how large portions of our population see the world. An example of a meta-narrative is how people view freedom. Another example of a meta-narrative that sees governments as always inefficient, the private sector is always efficient, taxes is always harmful, and public spending is always wasteful. This will lead to a small government and an underinvestment in public goods, Stiglitz maintains, and there's a lot of evidence that that has in fact taken place in the last several decades in the United States. So Stiglitz concludes, we have effectively given this meta-narratives by parts of the social medias, Fox News being a particular example. So therefore, we have to create what is a meta-narrative lens and the wealth-informed citizens through a government-supported, independent, and diverse media to counter what is, I think, correctly described as the Orwellian power and disinformation of private sector media that has led to polarization over the last 3 or 4 decades. So next slide. Jan.
It's there.
12. Problems of World Federation. This is progressive capitalism has discussed in the context of nation states, but there's a whole chapter on international trade and investment, which lists, Stiglitz lists the problems for a world federation if we had one. So today's system of governance over international trade and investment lacks fairness and legitimacy in terms of trade-offs of freedoms and rights and responsibilities. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have put pressure on developing countries to fund monetary policies according to neoliberal dictates, which have harmed the less developed countries enormously. Rich and powerful countries have failed to shut down tax havens that they could easily have done by restricting their corporations and citizens from taking advantage of the tax avoidance services of the tax havens. Key governments, including Germany, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, supported the drug companies' intellectual property rights that hurt many of the poorer countries in the COVID-19 crisis. Multinationals exploited globalization using global rules to avoid paying taxes anywhere. As there is a general tendency to reduce taxes by multinationals in order to attract them into different countries at the expenses of those countries, Ireland being a good example. And international trade has been neither free nor fair, as advocates have claimed. And finally, conditions imposed by the IMF and the World Bank often entailed weakening the power of unions and limiting progressive and corporate taxation in other states. So the next slide. So then is an alternative. This is Stiglitz' alternative framework for fair and just international economic investment architecture. International rules should allow countries to do as they please, as long as it does not harm other countries. One country's imposing capital controls is legitimate because it does not harm other countries. Intellectual property systems should be eliminated because it is grossly unfair. We need an international framework for resolving excess debt akin to domestic bankruptcy procedures. The latter consider both the well-being of the debtor and the broader societal interests. But on the international framework, there's no mercy shown to countries like Greece, who were in debt, to resolve their issues, short of destroying large parts of their economy and society. The IMF impositions on developing countries to lower their progressive taxes and worsen their labor conditions to pay off debt should be dropped. This is what happened specifically by the IMF with respect to the country of Greece. And finally, U.S. refusal to allow judges to the World Trade Organization's appellate court should end so that the rule of law can work for resolving trade disputes. So that is some of the alternatives contemplated in what could be world federalist trade, world federalism over trade. So that, I think, is the presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a wonderful presentation. Many things struck me, but the three things that struck me the most was your quote. I don't know whether it was Stiegler or somebody else, talking about freedom for wolves meant death to the sheep. You spoke about Rawls' veil of ignorance and how society needs to organize itself for social justice. And you spoke about meta-narratives and how they have shaped the world through social media. And it struck me that these are key principles that, at least it struck me, that these are things that affect society in many ways more than financial. And we need to keep in mind as we go along. And if I've been struck so much by your talk and presentation, I'm sure the others have been too. And we'll find out soon. We will now proceed to the Q&A, and I'll pass it over to Saba to handle to facilitate or moderate the Q&A. Saba, over to you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Peter, for your presentation. I think for me, a key takeaway was how you talked about freedom and fairness not only require national reforms, but also changes in global institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and media systems. I don't see any questions in the chat just yet, but I can kick it off with a question that I have. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Noam Chomsky's work and his book that he wrote on manufacturing consent. But in that book, he kind of argues how media often serves elite interests. So I was wondering if you had any comments on how that kind of relates to your points about social media shaping biased meta-narratives, or if you see any ties there.
Well, he's right. I think, in particularly with the Murdoch organized press in the United States, this is an organization that is very powerful, and it does serve the interests of the corporate sector at the expense of U.S. society. Social media is even more pervasive, I think, than Murdoch in the United States context. Given the sort of general apathy and lack of knowledge of the American public, they're heavily influenced. What they have decided that people will gravitate to media that are easily accessible and what has happened is you have a sort of a media that now singles out people with similar interests in one area and with other interests in other areas. So the social media is even worse than the national media of Murdoch. And also, of course, the social media news sort of tends to drive out any interest in the national media at the New York Times or the major public networks. So Chomsky's right, but I don't think there's a social media part to the argument as well as conventional media.
Okay. We do have two questions that popped up in the chat. So Keith McNeil wants to know whether the statement freedom is the most important value came from Hayek or from Stiglitz. Like just some clarification there.
No, it came from Stiglitz.
And he has also asked, wouldn't survival
Stiglitz
be
is right.
value?
Sorry?
He's also added in there, wouldn't survival be a more important value
Then
than freedom?
wouldn't survival be a more important value than freedom?
Yeah.
I suppose it would be, but it's the absence of freedom or the harms, I guess, the harms of certain freedoms of the rich that are threatening the survival of the rest of the community.
All right. We have a question from Rose. She's asking, what impact do you think the recent Trump imposed tariffs will have on unfolding changes?
Well, it's the more immediate effects is that there will be a lot of uncertainty and some probably reductions in or maybe even recessions in a number of countries, including the U.S. Eventually, if the tariffs are maintained, we'll be driven back into a situation where there is far less free trade than there used to be. That probably is a good thing. John Maynard Keynes' famous quote was that international immigration is fine, but ideally it's best to have as limited international trade as is feasible, because it is disruptive to countries that engage in that, and as a consequence, have their economies deteriorate. So, following the attempts of our current Prime Minister Carney to build an economy that is independent of the U.S., would be considered an ideal arrangement under Keynes's view, because it would then avoid any further instabilities that are inherently created by free trade.
Right. I think we have some hands up as well. Norbert, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to do two things. One is to let everyone know that if you want to speak, you can click on the react button and raise your hand. That way you'll be allowed to speak. I think my question has been sort of partially answered by Peter when he spoke about Rose's thing. My question was, in your presentation, you spoke about learning how the financial system in the US operates. But over the last few weeks, it seems like it changes every day. So it's difficult to keep a track of how they operate. And the question then I think was answered in the sense that we can insulate ourselves by what Carney is doing in terms of being less dependent on the U.S. But if you've got any additional thoughts on that.
So what was it? What was the
The
question?
question with Trump, the rules
Yeah.
of the
Oh,
game
yes.
keeps changing every day. So how do we keep
Yes.
studying how the U.S. operates?
How do we what?
How do we study how one of the president the slides was that we need to study how the financial system in the U.S. works.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The U.S. citizens have to. Yes, because the financial system is exploiting them. To take a good example, the financial system that convinced President Clinton to deregulate the Glass-Steagall Act that was set up in the Great Depression led to the creation of collateral debt obligations that went through the roof and finally resulted in the collapse of the real estate market which introduced the financial crisis of 2008. If you knew uh, how the system works, it would never have been allowed to happen. Now, to be fair, some of the people in the Federal Reserve didn't really understand how these collateral debt obligations were pyramided. So there was an implicit enormous risk built into them, which was destined to fail. But I don't know whether that answers the question.
Thank you,
I
Peter.
suppose if they understood it, they would not, as a matter of policy, allow it. If we had democracies where the public or the citizens basically make the policies, not the government, but the public, if they obviously are aware of how the system worked, they would never have allowed the changes that were made, say by Clinton or others, to occur. Let me end there.
I think Rose also has her hand up.
Yes, Peter, a very interesting presentation. Always, I learn something every time I hear you speak. I just wonder how you respond to the erosion of democracy that is going on throughout the world right now. George Packard wrote something recently in the Atlantic about trying to decide, for example, the U.S. whether they're living in a democracy or an autocracy, so you set out certain kind of objectives for strengthening democracy and bringing about equality and so on. I wonder if at this juncture, given what's going on, there shouldn't be a greater emphasis on strengthening democratic institutions that are gradually eroding, like the judiciary and who are in Packard's mind, staggering on like zombie institutions, giving the impression that democracy is still alive. I don't know if that.
Well, yeah, some of the institutions of democracy are, yeah, a lot of them are government institutions. If the people are aware of this, there would be all kinds of protests going on policy, but even on straightforward budgets. And the simple solution to the United States' problems right now is to impose as Thomas Piketty suggests, is simply a tax on wealth. We don't have a tax on wealth. We actually do have a tax on wealth in terms of the tax on residential property. But we've been reducing the tax rate for a variety of reasons. So if in a democracy, it's the collective people who decide on policies such as taxation, and the taxation of wealth is a tremendous solution to the government's problems of debt, and it doesn't cost the majority of the population anything. It improves public service.
Of course, you're advocating a taxation and an approach to governance that would be exercised by an administration that still believed in the rule of law. But you did talk a little in your presentation about the impact of media and how these different perspectives are swayed one way or another. So would you agree that in half the population, at least, that is interested in politics at all, has been hoodwinked into voting and for their against their own best interests, or just how do you see media shaping the attitudes and educating people to be more present and supportive of democratic?
Well, I'm thinking of formal education. I think extending formal education in universities, through the lives of all of these people. It's pretty obvious if they were educated about what in fact is going on, they would not be voting for governments that are not pursuing policies or pursuing policies of debt rather than raising taxes. Unfortunately, they don't vote either. But the problem is they're voting for representatives, supposed representatives, but the politicians are not representing the interests of the public. They're representing the interests of the corporate sector, which is a minority, and the rich, which are a minority of the population.
And the media has helped spin these exploitive policies into hoodwinking the public, I guess, into thinking that they are really voting to support changes that will be of benefit to them.
So my policies on that would be to regulate social media heavily and tax them for all of the income that are generated by all this nonsense.
Correct.
So we would basically eliminate the financial model of surveillance capitalism and generate revenues for the public, which would shut them down.
So and reintroduce the digital sales tax, I think that Carney just scrapped.
Right. So a democratic public would then summarily vote out a Carney government if they knew what was going on, because basically that's a policy that will increase the debt, which the public will have to pay. Mind you, the people who have the lower incomes are not going to be paying that much tax.
We have another question in the chat from N. Loveland. Sorry, I'm not sure what your first name is. But
Norton.
They're asking Norton. Okay, Norton is asking that in your presentation, you noted that social benefits like food stamps and whatnot have been cut or removed in the US. So he's asking how can we restore benefits for those in need so that society can truly organize around social justice, or how do you like tackle that?
Yeah, the only way I could see is that we have a mount opposition to that in a coalition of people uh, to insist on restoring the food stamps. And the implicit and the implication being is that you don't, you'll be summarily voted out of office at the next available election.
He just has another comment. Norton,
But
you
that's
can.
an institution we don't have. Sorry.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
So that's an institution we don't have, which was these protest groups, for example. There's not very many of them in the American society, and they're certainly not visible in terms of their protests against the food stamps or sort of the other like issues, taking away Social Security. It doesn't. You would think that there would be a huge opposition to the deliberate attempt to reduce Social Security in order to cover off the deficits of the U.S. government. But there's not.
Okay. Norton also followed up with another comment to his question. He says, Peter, you remind me that the Trudeau government proposed to increase the inclusion rates on capital gains from 50% to 66.6%, but that was soon wiped off the list. He's asking, do you have any comments or suggestions on this?
I think that was a great idea. In fact, that's one of the reasons I liked the Liberal Party when they first got in, when Trudeau first got in to office in 2013. They raised one of the progressive income tax rates greatly for the rich, and there was a Globe and Mail cartoon shortly after that of Trudeau sitting in this dark office, and behind him was this ghostly apparition. It was the ghost of Sir John Maynard Keynes, who would have recommended those high tax rates. The colossal mistake we made back with the Carter Commission is that we have the tax rates on capital gains. That has run through the economy for 50 years to the detriment of the government revenues.
I also noticed there was a question from John earlier that I missed. John is pointing out that that your recipe for change covers a lot of ground, and he's asking which part do you think that the WFMC could most effectively focus on promoting?
Probably on the international finance side that they could work. There are some coalitions developing more recently in Canada that also linked to environmental sustainability, 350.org. World Federalists should join that coalition. There's about 14 different civil society organizations involved in this. I think Rose will know what it's about. But those would be things that World Federalists Canada could join in Canada. We should also be advising the international, the IGF, the World Federalist Movement in the U.S., the policy organization. We should be, unless they've already figured it out, we should be adding to their research from Canada.
We have some questions about counteracting meta narratives. I think Raquel brought up an interesting point. Raquel says, before you had mentioned the need for society to organize, how would you recommend combating meta-narratives when trying to organize social justice movements? It seems at times these meta-narratives often harm the success of social justice movements.
Yes, some of the meta narratives do harm social units, but the meta narratives have to be created, I guess, by the educated community on the part of the government to at least bring them into the public domain so people realize that they do exist and why the meta narratives are either false in some cases or in other cases consistent with the democratic organization.
I believe Rose has a comment about the online harms bill to help counteract meta narratives. Rose, did you want to add to that at all, or?
Yes, well, that's a bill that's revived from the past administration when Trudeau was still in power. In fact, there are about 6 bills, I think, that died on the order paper when Parliament was prorogued that, in my view, would in some way address these problems involving meta narratives. And what social media does to distort facts and develop echo chambers amongst people who reinforce each other's views and leads to polarization of how people are interacting with each other, if at all. So I'm just wondering if Peter thinks this is in part a solution to these meta narratives in the same way that the government is proposing them, because there is some pushback, as there always is. The notion that it would be too harmful to freedom of expression or anything like that if there was some tampering, but with what is now perceived to be our right to free speech. There are counter arguments, of course, that there are limits to free speech, and like libel and slander, you can't get away with that sort of thing. And the Canadian government has also or our court system has respected the need to balance freedom from fear and harm to some extent with freedom of expression when it comes to things like violent media or pornography, and the way it's exploiting children and so on. And the criminal code has some views on that too. So I think that's the meta narratives in part, other than the a distortion of reality that is certainly spilling over into our political system in ways that's quite harmful.
Yeah, well, I think the issue of free speech is interesting. the Aristotelians defined free speech that was A, truthful, and B, non-intimidating. And much of what goes for free speech is untruthful. That's what's misinformation and disinformation is rampant. So basically, it needs to be, as Stiglitz points out, is that disinformation is incorrect. The narrative simply doesn't play, or is not truthful.
And it's also been argued, and I agree with this, that there's a lot of confusion between corporate freedom of enterprise when it comes to marketing of popular culture in particular,
right.
That being confused with freedom of speech and enterprise are not the same things, and there needs to be, in terms of educating the public, a better clarity in the differences. and because very often it's the rogue elements in society and large corporations or those that spew the worst aspects of social media and the meta narratives that are out there on the internet. They're the ones that are most adamant about free speech protection. So it's a bit of an irony that in some ways it's this overly simplistic interpretation of free speech is and or free expression, and what it means is ironically eroding our ability to exercise it, because hate speech does cancel out other kinds of rights that come under the umbrella of democratic norms.
All right. It
Yeah,
doesn't
it
look.
does. I think Stiglitz mentions in the States anyway, there ought to be a government supported um, a government supported public media, which would be designed to illustrate the absence of truth or logic in a lot of the narratives that come across in the private media and social media.
And when you
So
add to that, go ahead. The challenges of artificial intelligence. The Thomas Friedman in the New York Times has recently argued that what we need is when you talk about education, civic education for the public at large, there ought to be elements of morality introduced because that's really the only way. And in that context, there should be more collaboration rather than competition with China. That's the only way we're going to be able to control artificial intelligence and what it can do to us, and given its promises and perils. So that's perhaps another thing that needs to be considered from a global or world federalism point of view.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rose, for your comments. We are nearing the 3 o'clock mark, so I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I think we'll wrap up the Q&A. Thanks, Peter, for taking the time to answer our questions and for your presentation that gave us so much to reflect on about freedom, fairness, and justice. I'll pass it on over to Norbert. Norbert.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that excellent and enlightening presentation, and Saba for handling the Q&A, facilitating the Q&A. This presentation will join Peter's previous presentation, which was on reforming international economic institutions, on our YouTube channel, and other presentations that have been presented to us. Elizabeth May on a Global Climate Accountability Act, Seth Klein on greening the world economy, Andreas Bummel on Voice of the People at the UN, Rebecca Shute on legal alternatives to war, and many others.